Hey everybody, it's Kathy. Welcome to episode 4 of Mondays on the Mat. I'm coming to you live from my office slash yoga room with, of course, my co-host Agnes, who's down. Sorry about that. We got a little pause there as my timer went off telling me it was time to start. So, hey, we started. Yay, we got distracted by that. So, as I was saying, Agnes is here with me, and we're going to be talking about downward facing dog today. Before I do, I just want to say, hey, is the weather not amazing? The sky is so blue, and like the white flowers on the trees, and oh my gosh. It's a gorgeous day, so make sure at some point you go out and enjoy that. But here's what's going to happen today with downward facing dog. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures out of my books, so just to give you an idea that there are different variations on the shape of downward facing dog. And then we'll talk about a little bit about some musculature stuff. And then I'm going to show you and talk to you all about how to really articulate your downward facing dog, and wrap up with a variation if holding down dog is still challenging for you, or if you're working with an injury or something like that, or you're just having one of those days where you're exhausted and you're in class and you're like, oh my gosh, there's no way. Another downward facing dog, forget it. Okay, so I want to start off by looking at what I call old school downward facing dog. Here is the amazing and fabulous Mr. Iyengar, and you can see that in his downward facing dog, his head is on the floor, his arms are in way deep extension, and he's in a back bend. And that is absolutely a valid, reasonable version of downward facing dog for someone who has not only the flexibility but the ability to articulate and maintain the posture without dunking into the joints. And I think for most of us, that's not a wise variation of the pose. So let's take a peek real quick over here from Eric Schiffman's book, which I just lost the page because I had it marked with the other book. So I'm pulling it up really fast. Because what I love about this book is he's going to show us more reasonable version of downward facing dog is for us to have a straight line from the wrists through the shoulders and up and out through the pelvis. I think this is smarter and safer for most of us. And then he does talk about how you can go into that deeper version later, but for most of us, this is the best place to be. So I'm going to talk about how to create that shape wisely. Last week when we were talking about Tadasana, I spent a lot of time talking about neutral legs and a neutral pelvis, meaning anatomically neutral, because from there, generally the spine is going to align itself into anatomic neutral without a lot of effort. So I want to take a quick peek at anatomic neutral for the spine. You have a slight inward curve at the low back, the lumbar spine, followed by an outward curve, the thoracic spine, and then an inward curve of the cervical spine at the neck with the pelvis in the neutral position. And the main purpose of downward facing dog is to elongate the spine, keeping it in anatomically neutral. Now I know some of us have variations in our spine, maybe scoliosis, a curvature or something like that. But even if we have those things happening, you're still going for as much length with as neutral of a spine as you can get in downward facing dog. So the last thing I'm going to show you before we dive into looking at it on my body and talking to you about human variation is I have this really cool book that shows the musculature of some of the different poses and what's happening. So here's downward facing dog muscularly speaking. And what's cool is that it's showing where there is in lengthening and where there is strengthening. So in downward facing dog, all of the muscles that are lit up along the back side of the body are lengthening. So you can see they're lengthening through the back body, the gluteal muscles, the hips, and down the backs of the legs. And then in the front body is engagement. The soles of the feet. This is why I got into Tadasana first last week, guys, is because you need to engage and lift the arches of your feet to help with the release and the stretch of the muscles in the backs of the legs. So muscles generally work in pairs, and we've got one side that's engaged so that the other side can lengthen. And you can see this happening in down dog. We've got the sole of the foot engaged to lengthen the back of the calf muscle for ease of description. And then we've got some engagement here in the front of the thigh, not the quadriceps, but some other deep muscles. And then you can see the lengthening there in the hamstring. Front body engagement, lengthening. And then here, triceps engaging. And it would have been interesting, I think, if they had shown the sole of the hand real similar to the sole of the foot. And I'm going to talk about that here in a second. But remember, our main objective is a long spine from the crown of the head up and out through the pelvis. So the legs, last week I was talking about anatomically neutral. I want to grab this back really fast. Shoot, and I lost the page, so bear with me for a second as I pull that back up. Because last week when I was talking about anatomically neutral, or what I can do, I'll grab the skeleton instead. So in downward facing dog, what's going to happen is the legs are going to stay in this neutral position with the exception of flexion at the hip joint. So if you could imagine, we take this skeleton guy and just flex at the hips. This from the pelvis through the spine and the crown of the head should remain unchanged. Okay, so that's kind of the big key there. Okay, so now getting a little bit more articulate. Downward facing dog is a pose that took me probably at least 15 years to really feel like I understood it, and now going on a little over 20 years, I feel like I've got this guy. So, if I'm talking about all of these pieces and they don't make sense, or you feel like I'm hearing you, but my body is not responding, it's totally normal. I feel like even though we do this pose over and over and over, it has so many pieces to it that it can take a long time for it all to come together. When we talk about a yoga pose, anything that's on the ground is considered the foundation, and we build a pose from the foundation. So we could build downward facing dog either from the feet through the legs and out through the hands, or we could build it from the hands through the torso and out through the feet. I'm going to go with that second version because the arms do a lot of weight bearing in this pose, and it's technically considered an inversion. And inversions we usually build from, well, depending on the inversion, we would build them from the hands up. So first, getting into the hands and the arms. This is, and also why I'm going with this first, is the hands and the arms are generally the place where I see people struggle the most, or where I see the greatest misalignment. So when we place the hands in downward facing dog, ideally the hands are flat to the floor. But what I often see is a cupping. I'm going to move the camera down to the floor, you guys, and so that I can really articulate this for you a little bit more carefully. And if you've got questions or comments along the way, please, please, please ask so that I can clarify. Sometimes things totally make sense in my brain, but maybe aren't necessarily clear to you. So please feel free. And if you're watching this later, of course, also ask me later. So here we go. What I often see when people come into downward facing dog is the inner edges of the hands cup, and there's a lot of pressure in this outside area of the wrist, and it creates a lot of wrist discomfort. So the very first thing we need to concern ourselves with in down dog is that we have flattened the palm and pressing more into thumb and first finger. But what's going to happen, you'll see if I really do that a lot, watch my shoulder. It's going to roll up and hike into my ears. And if we're doing that on both sides, we get really crunched up in the neck. Okay, so the arms actually have to do two separate movements, and this is why it's challenging, is because we're asking the arm to articulate two different things. The forearm is going to pronate, that means it spins down to the ground, as the upper arm spins opposite, it spins away. And then you need to engage your tricep muscles to keep the elbow lengthened. So if you wanted to play with that, you could take your arm out to the side and from the shoulder, turn your whole arm open to the ceiling, keeping the upper arm rotating backwards, rotate the forearm to face down. So it's hard, right? Upper arm rolling out, forearm rolling in. But that's what we want to have happen in downward facing dog. So forearm rolling down, that way you can press more into thumb and first finger. Upper arms rolling out, elbows lengthened, so tricep muscles are engaged. Then there's a forward pressing away with the hands. I'm going to start to turn sideways now so that you can see this. And I have to get a little bit back from the camera for you to see the whole shape. So if I'm not talking loud enough, somebody just give me a shout out like, hey, talk a little louder so that we can hear you. Okay, so as I'm building downward facing dog from the floor, the hands are going to move a little bit forward of the shoulders. And like I was just explaining, pressing into thumb and first finger, forearms are rotating inward, upper arms are rotating out. Then as the hips lift, there's a forward press with the hands. Oh, I'm going to crawl a little bit more forward and back. So as I press my hands forward and down into the ground, right? Forward and down, you can see that my hips move up and back. So what's happening in the shoulder is that the shoulder blade is lifting up. But as we lift the shoulder blade up, then again, we can start to get that crunch in the neck, which is why we're spinning the upper arms out a little bit. That way, instead of this, we've got space. Is my hair in the way? So instead of that, we've got spaciousness in your neck. There's going to be a cat. Hey! This is Guildenstern, part of the show. Okay. She's growing out. Bye. Say bye to Guildenstern. Okay, so sorry about the interruption there. Pressing the palms forward and away, elongating through the spine, so spine neutral. What tends to happen is, number one, round spine because the backs of the legs are so tight. So if that is pertaining to you, you need to engage your quadriceps and tilt your sits bones up until the spine gets long. And that means your heels may not touch the floor. The other thing is those of us that can do too much. And it almost starts to look like that Iyengar picture. And so for those of us who are doing too much, we need to lift up out of the shoulders and tilt the sits bones down. Lastly, the last thing we worry about in downward facing dog is the straight legs and the heels on the floor. So if you can have a long neutral spine and the legs can straighten, lastly, work on bringing your heels down. But if bringing the heels down starts to round your low back, you come up on the toes a little, bend your knees, and lift your sits bones up. So then the last thing I want to mention, as we were talking about earlier, is legs start in the neutral position. And nothing should change for a downward facing dog except that you've flexed at the hip crease. So if I were to walk forward to you now in down dog, you can see, with the exception that my head is lifted, I didn't change the legs. You could watch that again. So I'm standing in Tadasana with neutral legs and a neutral pelvis. The pelvis and the spine don't change. I flex at the hip joint and lean forward and walk the hands out. The legs have remained in neutral Tadasana legs with the exception of the flexion at the hip. And when we come into downward facing dog, the flexion at the wrist, that's not your wrist, that's your ankle, hello. The flexion at the ankle also deepens. So for some of us who don't have a deep flexion, dorsiflexion towards the front body in the ankle, then the heels are going to rise. Okay? So the main component, I don't know where to put the camera. The main component is the long spine. And I feel like really importantly is the actions in the arms. Most of us, if we're going to start to feel any sort of discomfort around downward facing dog, it's because we're doing this collapse in the wrist and then crunching up in the shoulders. So you really have to engage the arm muscles. Lastly, ladies, is that the hands need to be wide enough apart. So I also see a lot of women step their hands too close together because we've got this image in our mind that our shoulders are narrower than our hips. But again, if we go back and look at my friend the skeleton, anatomically speaking, your shoulder heads are wider than your hip points and your hip creases. So your hands should be wider than your feet in downward facing dog. Because we're talking about aligning your skeleton, not necessarily aligning your muscles and everything else that's on top of the bones. So what do you do if downward facing dog is still really super challenging to hold for very long, or you feel a lot of strain in your shoulders, you're working with injury, or you're just having a day where not happening because there's so many downward facing dogs in a vinyasa or flow type class? And then I would recommend quarter downward facing dog, which is downward facing dog done on the knees. So you make sure that your knees stack right on top of your hips, and then the rest of the body comes into downward facing dog, pressing the inner edges of the hands down. So again, the forearms are rotating inward as the upper arms rotate out. Your triceps are engaged. You can see there, that's my tricep engagement. And then not letting the chest dunk to the floor, but keeping the front body pulled in and your spine in neutral. Press forward and away and feel like you're squeezing your hands towards center line. So the whole upper body is doing the exact same thing of downward facing dog. And that's a really great way to either build strength for your downward facing dog, or again, if you're working with some sort of injury or you're just tired, quarter down dog is a really, really great option. So in a nutshell, that was downward facing dog, and I see a couple of people are still joining us now. So make sure that you go back and watch the first part of the video so that you can see all of the articulated pieces of downward facing dog. And if you have questions now or if you have questions later, please feel free to drop them down there and I will do my best to answer them. And thanks to Lisa for asking the question of tell me and show me more about downward facing dog. Next week I'm answering Jessica's question, how do you get into upward facing dog? So I think those two kind of flow nicely together. So thanks for those questions. If you have any burning questions about yoga, please shoot them my way and I will do my very best to answer you on an upcoming live episode. And come see me in class this week and we can work on articulating your downward facing dog. Tuesday 6:30 to 8, Wednesday 5:30 to 7, Friday 9:30 to 11, and Saturday 9 to 10:30. I have a waiting list for private lessons right now, so if you're wanting a private, shoot me a message and I will make sure to get you on my waiting list. Otherwise, ladies, have a beautiful day. Tune in. Tune in next week when we take a look at upward facing dog. And again, shoot me your questions about yoga, and we'll go from there. Have a beautiful day. Thanks for watching. Namaste.